All right, maybe about time to start the last session and also our last keynote speech. Valerie needing no introduction, so I would just say, she will, she's going to give a beautiful paper on how the British exiting EU shock will affect our economy.
All right, thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and it's been a great conference. I'm sure that everybody will agree. I saw so many good papers, and so many papers I didn't even have time to see, but luckily I'll be able to read them later. So this is based on my forthcoming Handbook of Macroeconomics chapter. It's Macroeconomic Shocks and Their Propagation. Initially, when I started writing this, I was going to talk about most of the leading shocks, and I was going to do multi-country. And I had to focus it, and it's still 100 published pages. So what I do in this chapter is lay out some groundwork and then talk about some of the major shocks. But then the idea is to inspire people to do more research in these kinds of areas, to think about other shocks, to think about other ways of identification. So as motivation, let's go back 100 years. What was the challenge in the earliest 20th century if you're thinking about, say, business cycles? They were trying to figure out how to explain business cycles in a model with damped oscillations. They were trying to get this sort of regular pattern with some bits of erratic flavors, but trying to do it in a model that was very hard because most of their models had damped oscillations. Then there was an important insight by Eugen Sletsky, who was a statistician, and he wrote a paper in 1927 in Russian that showed that moving sums of random variables could produce time series that looked very much like the movement of economic time series. And the quote is, sequences of rising and falling movements like waves with marks of certain approximate uniformities and regularities. So it was just a dramatic finding that he could basically use stochastic processes with random shocks to create something that looked like economic time series. So once people figured that out, then the question was the subsequent challenge. What are these macroeconomic shocks? And they had some ideas back then, weather shocks, trade shocks, all kinds of things like that. But we're still searching for those. So let me say first what my definition of a macroeconomic shock is and what I'm going to use in this handbook chapter. I adopt Blanchard and Watson's and Bernanke's notion that shocks should be economically meaningful, primitive, exogenous forces. So certainly the recent vote in Britain, you might say that's the shock, or it might be tied to some underlying force, but economically meaningful, primitive, exogenous forces. I see them as the empirical counterparts of the shocks that we discuss in our economic models. So say a TFP shock, or some of the government spending shocks that I've done, you might think of it as a change in the preference parameter on government spending and the social planner utility function. Now, these shocks can also be used as instruments to test theories. So just even apart from trying to explain business cycles, these shocks are interesting because if we can identify them in the data, we can see whether the data behaves the way that our theory suggests it should. Okay? I want to make a distinction of shocks versus innovations versus instruments because I think that there's a lot of confusion in the literature. All right, many times researchers will use the term shock when they mean innovation or instrument. Okay, and when Chris Sims wrote his 1972 paper, he just said innovations. He never called them shocks. But by 1980, despite claiming to be atheoretical, he was calling his innovations shocks. An innovation is the residual from a reduced form VAR. An instrument is a variable that satisfies exogeneity and hopefully relevance, and it can be used to estimate structural parameters. All right? Now, identification assumptions may link shocks to innovations or to instruments, but you should always keep in mind that they are distinct concepts and they are not the same thing. It's your identifying assumption that links the two, or the three. Okay? Conditions that I think a macroeconomic shock should satisfy in terms of the empirical work. All right? It must be exogenous with respect to the current and lagged endogenous variables in the model. It must be uncorrelated with other exogenous shocks. Otherwise, we can't identify the unique causal effects of one exogenous shock relative to another. Now, I've been having some debates with Bob Hall. He hasn't said it, but I think he's come over to my side, my way of viewing things. So some people will say, that sometimes, he says that the monetary and the fiscal shock can be correlated. What I would say is, no, the innovations can be correlated, but there's some underlying shock. So an example is some of the military spending shocks that I look at. Some geopolitical event makes the US want to increase government spending. It may also make the US want to increase taxes, and it may also make it want to do something with monetary policy. So those innovations will be correlated, but there's an underlying shock that we probably are best modeled as an underlying preference parameter in the social welfare function. Also, it must represent either unanticipated changes in exogenous variables or news about anticipated future movements in exogenous variables. And I'm going to talk about this aspect quite a bit. I talk about it a lot in the chapter, and I'm also going to talk about it here, where I'm just doing some of the highlights. All right? Main candidates for shocks. I come from a more domestic macroeconomic point of view. That's what I'm going to list here. But certainly people who think open economy and trade can think of many more shocks. So monetary shocks have received the lion's share of attention. I think that's because central banks have much more money than anybody else to fund conferences and researchers. Deviations from the monetary policy rule or shifts to that rule. Fiscal shocks, changes in government purchases, taxes, or transfers that are not part of the endogenous response of policy. Technology shocks, all right? So fluctuations in TFP or in investment-specific technological change. And of course, news shocks, all right? So this is something that has gotten more and more attention, and it's news about future exogenous changes in policy and technology. Rather than thinking that everything is unanticipated, what we figured out is there's a lot that's anticipated. And so the economy is going to start responding when the news arrives, and we need to keep track of that. Now, what I actually did in this chapter, rather than treating news as a separate shock, because I figured out in all of these main shocks, news can be an important thing. I actually talk about news in the context of each of the individual shocks. Additional shocks, oil shocks, sectoral shocks, terms of trade shocks, uncertainty, preferences, the public voting crazy things, shocks. You can have all kinds of things. We're certainly shocked today with Brexit. And we can figure out which part was unanticipated by what happened to the stock market. So that's an example of a shock. Okay. Now, over 20 years ago, John Cochrane wrote a really nice paper that I always liked just from the very beginning called Shocks. And here is a quote from the abstract of that. And in that paper, he was looking at what were the standard shocks at that time, which are very similar to the ones now. Money shocks. There they would actually look at shocks to the stock of money rather than interest rates. But he tried oil shocks and credit shocks, and he concluded that none of those popular candidates could really explain much of the forecast error variance of output and hours. So then he started examining consumption shocks, which are basically his idea of news shocks, and he found that it was really hard to construct a model that would actually give you business cycle shocks from news. And he said, if this view is correct, we will forever remain ignorant of the fundamental causes of economic fluctuation. So rather of a pessimistic ending to that article. So I'm focusing my chapter on how we made progress in the last 20-something years since Cochrane wrote his paper and ended up rather pessimistically. And I'm going to argue yes, and I should say in earlier versions of this chapter, when I had to give it at a conference, I was very skeptical then because I'd only done the monetary part and was saying, you know what, I don't think we understand things. I've now made more progress for the final version, so I'm not as pessimistic as I was. So I am arguing we have made progress. We still have far to go, but I think that we've made quite a bit of progress, so we don't need to be as pessimistic. All right, so the outline of the rest of my presentation, I'm just going to do a brief overview of some of the useful tools for identifying shocks. I'm going to talk about a new method for calculating impulse responses because it's very useful just in practice, and I actually use it as a way to synthesize other people's shocks in this handbook chapter. I'm going to talk a lot about this important new insight about foresight in news and the impact it has on thinking about trying to estimate the effects of shocks. I'm going to give a brief summary of findings on the three leading shocks, monetary, fiscal, Fiscal will have both government spending and taxes, and then technology shocks. And then at the very end, I'm going to do a variance decomposition with some of my favorite leading shocks to see what drives business cycles. Okay. And this is just, as I said, just a highlight of some of the parts of the chapter. So I'm not going to talk about details, and you're free to look on my website to see the details. So I hang out with a lot of applied microeconomists. You know, I really like the sorts of things they do, the questions, and the applied microeconomists in my department are very nice. But some of them sort of put their noses up to macro people because they say, oh, you guys aren't thinking about identification seriously, you're not thinking about instrument relevance, and that was definitely true, you know, just say 6 years ago. And Angrist and Pischke wrote their Journal of Economic Perspectives piece saying that macro really hadn't made much progress empirically relative to the other ones. So, you know, I think they have some points, but here's why identification is so much harder in macro. So, you know, we have to be much smarter to do it. In contrast to much applied microeconomics, macroeconomists ask questions for which dynamics are all important, general equilibrium effects are crucial, and expectations have powerful effects, okay? If you look at applied micros, sometimes none of those things appear in there, okay? That makes it a lot easier to do a natural experiment, okay? Moreover, in contrast to microeconomics, the two-way flow between the theory and empirics in macroeconomics is very active, all right? And I think that's really, really healthy about macro. All right, so let's talk about identification, because that's a really important part of you know, doing empirical work in macro. So I'm going to talk about some long-standing methods that have been out there. Cholesky decomposition, all right, which, you know, came up in the 1970s, 80s. This uses recursiveness assumptions. It's not always well-founded theoretically. Okay, typically it's been the sort of default, the first recourse for people. I'm hoping that we can move to a case where it's the last resort. Okay, just because it's not as well founded theoretically. Sometimes you don't have anything else you can use, so you can use a Cholesky decomposition. Other contemporaneous restrictions, structural VARs. Cholesky, of course, is just a special case. There you can use, say, theoretical estimates or estimates from some other literature to pre-specify a coefficient, which then can help you identify things. And I'll give an example when I get to the fiscal stuff. There are sign restrictions. So I saw somebody here using sign restrictions earlier to identify the effects of a shock on a variable y. You might identify the shock using sign restrictions on the responses of other variables. And Stock and Watson also have a chapter in the Handbook of Macro, and they talk a lot of, it's called set identification. So I leave most of the details to them. Other possible restrictions are restrictions at long horizons. So you can identify a shock according to whether it contributes to permanent component of an endogenous variable. I've used that before for TFP shocks. Or you can identify the shock as the one that maximizes the forecast error variance share of variables at some finite horizon age. This is becoming much more popular, and it seems to be more robust than that method. So I would say that for the most part, the second method is much better. Factor augmented VARs, FAVRs. This helps overcome this tension between parsimony and making sure you have the right conditioning set. All right, so for example, if you're thinking about monetary policy, that's where it's been used a lot, you want to make sure that you've specified the Federal Reserve's rule well so that all the kinds of variables they might look at when they're deciding what interest rate to set. But you don't want to put 120 variables in there. So the FAVR basically takes out the principal components from a set of a whole bunch of variables, and it includes that in the vector autoregression. So it's a nice way to deal with those sorts of problems. And then narrative methods, one of my favorite methods. Here, you say, let's get new data rather than just putting restrictions on existing data. So, for example, you can construct series from historical documents to identify the reason and or the quantities associated with a particular change in a variable and try to just use reasons that are exogenous. And then there's also high-frequency identification. Again, that's going out and getting more data. So this has been used particularly in the monetary economics literature. What you do is you look at, say, financial futures prices during key windows, such as the 30 minutes around a Federal Open Market Committee meeting, and then look at how those futures change and take that as an unanticipated shock about something that happened at the FOMC. All right. Now, a new method, it's sort of a combo method that takes some of these newer external series and incorporates them in VARs. And these are known either as proxy SVARs or external instruments. They're the same thing. So suppose that you're trying to identify some shock, epsilon IT, and you have some external instrument Z. Say you constructed it from a narrative source, or you have financial futures or something like that. Then this series is a valid instrument for identifying the shock that you want if it satisfies the standard instrument conditions, which is, first of all, relevance. So that instrument actually helps explain part of that shock, but also, of course, exogeneity, that it's uncorrelated with the other shocks. Okay? And Stock and Watson developed this just in some notes in 2008 when they gave a time series mini course, and then followed it up with a 2012 Brookings paper, but then Mertens and Robin independently came up with this idea as well. Okay? Now, another very different method that uses more structural, theory-based methods to identify shocks are Dsge model identification. So you specify the Dsge model, you know, the first order conditions of the consumer and the firms and the price setting. This is all like, say, for example, Smets and Wouters. And then you assume you know the ARMA structure of the unobserved shocks. Then you estimate the model and back out the shocks. So Smets and Wouters is one key example. Another way of doing it is like Cristiano et al. Did that. And that's also a nice method. Let me say something that I didn't include a slide. Another method that I advocate is what I call a Dsge Monte Carlo. So suppose you have a reduced, sort of a vector autoregression type of way of identifying things. And you have some new method to do it. The one way to test the method is to do what I call a Dsge Monte Carlo. Simulate the data from a model and then see if your method can actually pick up those shocks. This was first done by Ersig et al. And then Charikyo McGrattan also did this sort of thing. And in the working paper version of my QJE paper on government spending, I actually did this to show that a standard VAR couldn't pick up the shocks if they were anticipated. Okay. So suppose we have our shock. All right, we've done the identification. All right. Now we want to see the dynamic response of the key variables of the economy. So if we're running a VAR, it's very easy to do this. We've estimated our reduced form VAR, and then all we do is invert parameters to get the moving average representation, and then calculate the impulse response. Now, the thing to realize there is that the impulse responses depend in a nonlinear way on the parameters of the reduced form. So your VAR needs to be properly specified in order to get the correct impulse response. An alternative is a method advocated by Oscar Jordan in a 2005 AER paper. And he calls it local projections. I just call it the Jordan method. Okay, so this is apart from identification. Suppose that you've identified your shock, and in fact you can do it within his method if it's, say, a Cholesky decomposition. And you want to know what the impulse response of variables are to it. So suppose you care about some variable X, which could be GDP, whatever you want. What you do is you take that variable X. If you want to know what the impulse response is at horizon H, then you regress X at T plus H on the shock at T. And then you have, say, some control variables. He calls those mopping up variables. And, you could look in more detail at either his paper or my chapter. And then you just run that again for another H. So all you're doing is running a series of ordinary least squares regressions of the variable that you've moved up a horizon each time on that shock at T. And that actually plots out the impulse response. It's just like doing a direct forecast, because it's saying, how does the path of that variable differ when epsilon takes the value 1 versus when epsilon takes the value 0? And that theta IH is the impulse response. Okay. Now, there are some advantages to this method. One is it imposes fewer restrictions. Okay, so VAR is going to impose a lot of restrictions. I think it's a really useful cross-check on your VAR, right? If the Jordan method's giving you really different impulse responses from your VAR, you might want to think about respecifying your VAR. The third thing is, and the reason I had started using it was in my work with Sarah Zuberi, because Auerbach and Grodnichenko had figured out in their second paper on state dependence that the Jordan method is a really easy way to incorporate state dependence without having to do all of the kind of nonlinear VAR stuff. Now, it does have disadvantages. you're putting fewer restrictions on, typically your estimates are less precise, they're more erratic. And sometimes you get these oscillations at long horizons. Maybe they're there, I'm not sure, but it differs from vector autoregression, so I think people need to look at that a little bit more. Okay? Foresight and news. Okay, so this is cropping up in multiple literatures. Okay? So all of our theories say that agents should react now if news arrives about the future. Okay? Now, there's different ways that you can think about news coming. So some exploit this as a possible contribution to fluctuations that are important. So there was an old idea by Pigou and Keynes that news about future TFP or all kinds of other things could actually lead to fluctuations now. And that view was revived by Baudry and Portier. But that's not the end of it, okay? Turns out that if there's news about the future and you haven't incorporated that in your usual VAR, most usual VARs won't, then you will get the wrong answer. If you want to know how wrong, ask Eric Leeper, because Leeper, Walker, and Yang really showed the yes, and ask Susan too, yeah. Now also, foresight by policymakers complicates things even more, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the context of the monetary. I do more in the chapter. All right? So let's go through just sort of 3 leading shocks: monetary policy shocks, fiscal policy shocks, and technology shocks. All right? And as I said, there are many more. So this is just to get people interested in pursuing these things further and not necessarily always focus on these 3 kinds of shocks. All right, monetary policy shocks. So I hadn't done empirical work in monetary for a while, and so when I started writing the thing, I said, okay, well, I need to get up to date on it. And it was like falling into a swamp. And that's the reason I only ended up doing 3 shocks, because the monetary literature is just vast. And the 1999 Handbook of Macro had an entire chapter, the Cristiano et al. Chapter, devoted to monetary shocks. And I had to include it in this chapter with all the other shocks. So first the question, why do we want to identify shocks to monetary policy? Well, first of all, you can think of it as just an instrument, all right? That we want to see if there is a causal effect of monetary policy on output, the old Friedman and Schwartz kind of argument. But then there's also, can they explain part of business cycles? And remember, the Sims 1972 that said, look, shocks to money explain a lot of the forecast error variance decomposition for output. Okay. Now, however, what does it mean if we find that monetary shocks account for very little of the variance of output? All right. It could mean that monetary policy doesn't matter, or it could mean that monetary policy matters a lot, but that most changes in monetary policy are due to the systematic component rather than random shocks to the rule. Okay, because when we talk about shocks, we're talking about shock to the rule, not the systematic component. Now, what is a monetary policy shock? All right. Other than random coin flipping, the most frequently discussed source of monetary policy shocks is shifts in central bank preferences caused by changing weights on inflation versus unemployment in the loss function, or by a change in the political power of individuals on the FOMC. It's amazing. I mean, given how much monetary policy shocks have been studied, it's amazing how few people are kind of serious about the economic source of the shocks. Only a few papers have explicitly linked the empirically identified shocks to shifts in estimated central bank preferences. Actually, one was by Michael Aoyang and Gary Ramey, my husband. But there are and then another one by a UCSD student, Amit Lakdawala. But very few people, they just say, oh, here's a shock. Do we really think that Janet Yellen is just, randomly changing the interest rate that's not part of the thing? We don't really think that. So we need to be more serious about what those are. All right, so 3 leading identification methods. S-bars, these are discussed at length in Cristiano, Eichenbaum, and Evans. You can think of it as just a souped-up Cholesky decomposition. Think of ordering the federal funds rate last. I think that's what that says. Then there's the Romer 2004 narrative Green Book measure, where they're really serious about thinking about what information the Federal Reserve has, or you can do this for any central bank. So what they do is include the Green Book forecasts and then regress the target interest rate, that's the narrative part, on those forecasts, and then use the residual as the shock. But again, the question is, what are those shocks? And then high-frequency identification. That's become very popular recently. Use movements in Fed funds futures around Federal Open Market Committee dates. Okay. So I go through several of these shocks in the chapter. Okay. And let me just talk about guerrilla karate monetary shocks. It's just one example. So they use the federal funds futures to identify high-frequency surprises around FOMC announcements. The reason that they wanted to use this is because they wanted to avoid the standard recursive identification, the Cholesky. And that was particularly important because they wanted to include financial variables such as risk spreads in the VAR. They also wanted to capture the fact that over time the Fed has increasingly relied on communication to influence market beliefs about the future paths of interest rates. So in fact, they used a one-year T-bill rate as their main interest rate variable. Okay? So they use this proxy SVAR external instrument. So this high-frequency stuff is used as an instrument to identify the shock. Now, something that's interesting is the Fed funds futures are only available starting 1990 on, but they estimate the reduced form part of the VAR going back to 1979. Turns out this is going to be important, so remember that. What do they get for their impulse response functions? Everything looks beautiful. You know, the one-year rate goes up when you have a positive shock to interest rates and then comes down. The industrial production, there's a little blip up, not significant, and then it falls, all right? So an increase in interest rates that are supposedly exogenous causes industrial production to fall. The Gilchrist-Zagrajcic excess bond premium also goes up, so risk spreads go up. And then prices actually kind of go down for a while. They fall and then stay at a level for about 10 months and then decrease more. So these are known as beautiful monetary policy results. They're just what everybody's prior was. So I did some explorations with these shocks along with quite a few other shocks. So that Fed funds future shock is in some ways news, okay? But yet they only use it as an instrument in their regression, which I've asked Eric this, but he hasn't answered yet. I think that's potentially problematic, and maybe Susan could say that too. So the representation may not be fundamental. Now, they estimate their VAR, as I said, from 79 to 2012, but they use the instrument from 1990 to 2012. You can actually do this with external instruments. But however, that means that the dynamics are potentially influenced by the very volatile 1979-82 period. So then I said, well, what if we use their shocks? So I'm taking their estimated shock as an off-the-shelf shock and use it in the Jordan local projection framework, which doesn't rely on the reduced form VAR parameters. Now, necessarily, this is estimated from 1990 to 2012. Okay? I get very different results. Okay? So the one-year rate, rather than that nice go up and then come down, it goes up for a while, and it goes down. Industrial production, it's imprecisely estimated, but that's just going up. It's supposed to go down. It's going up. CPI isn't doing anything for 2.5 years, then finally starts coming down. And the excess bond premium isn't doing anything, all right? So the results really change when I use the Jordan method. Other features of their shock, it's predicted by its own past value, okay? Shocks aren't supposed to be predicted by their own past values. The correlation with the Romer shock, where I updated, is 0.25. So we'd like those shocks to be highly correlated if they're both representations of the same kind of shock. It's not as high as we would like. I also found that the Green Book forecast actually forecasts the Gertler karate shock, which is something that shouldn't happen. However, if I use both of their shocks, I can't reject the over-identifying restrictions. Now, I didn't just beat up on them, I beat up on a lot of methods on monetary in this. For example, take the Cristiano, Eichenbaum, and Evans method. They look so beautiful in their book. If you try to estimate it for the later period, 83 on, suddenly what's supposed to be contractionary monetary shocks are expansionary. And that happens with many other specifications. Lifting that recursiveness assumptions, basically this Cholesky, can lead to estimates that imply expansionary effects, even in a longer sample. And then many VAR impulse response functions are not robust to using the Jordan local projection method. So I was very pessimistic, the first round of this, but I'm a little bit less pessimistic now for the following reasons. The most likely reason for the breakdown of many specifications in the later sample is simply that we can no longer identify monetary policy shocks well. Why? Well, it's because monetary policy is now being conducted more systematically, all right? We have the science of monetary policy. What that means is that we don't get these wild gyrations like we did in the 1950s and 1960s that were just so great from an econometric point of view, but just terrible from a policy point of view. And so it's likely that what we're calling monetary shocks, if you run one of those standard VARs, most of that stuff in that error term that you're identifying as a shock is really maybe the effects of superior information on the part of the Federal Reserve, foresight by agents, and noise. All right, and that's why you just get such crazy results. Second, I still think that the best evidence that money matters is the historical case studies such as Friedman and Schwartz, and then a wonderful paper by François Velde in the JPE about France in the 1700s. It's a really good natural experiment he analyzes. And then time series models based on samples from the bad old times, okay, where there's just more information in the data. I think monetary policy can have big effects, but it's likely that monetary shocks are no longer an important source of macro instability. While this is bad news for econometrics, it's great news for economic policy, all right? It's not a source of instability anymore like it was in past times. All right, how about fiscal shocks? Uh-huh. But see, because we're stuck at the zero lower bound?
Well,
yeah. No, if you believe that's the rule, but then here's where I say, okay, you tell me what fundamental economic thing is changing that's exogenous with respect to the economy, that's leading the Federal Reserve to depart from that rule. So that's what I would argue. Yeah. Do we really think their preferences change? Okay. So fiscal policy shocks. So it's a lot easier to understand the economics of this. All right. Fiscal authorities are often concerned with many things that aren't correlated with the current state of the economy. All right. Now, until recently, there was much less research on fiscal. In fact, when the Great Recession hit, the rest of the profession woke up to the fact that there was hardly anybody studying fiscal policy anymore, and they were shocked to find that there wasn't a consensus on the multiplier. Okay. Now, fortunately, there's been much more research since 2008, and the economy hit the zero lower bound. All right. So let me just talk briefly about three widely used identification methods. So one is just a Cholesky decomposition where government spending is ordered first. It's called Blanchard and Perotti. It's great if you can get a Cholesky decomposition named after yourself, but they had used it. You just assume government spending does not respond to GDP within the quarter. I was interested, first of all, in having things that are exogenous and that are unanticipated, or at least news, because my argument was that most changes in government spending are anticipated. And it was because I had looked at all of this military spending, which is, by the way, most of the fluctuations in federal purchases are due to military events. So to deal with that, I had read through Business Week and Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, to find when there were geopolitical events that led to a change in the forecast for the path of government spending, and then calculated what that present value was, because that was just one summary statistic that had a lot of meaning in the context of a neoclassical model. A nice recent paper by Benzeev and Papa used medium horizon restrictions to get defense spending news. So it's a shock that's orthogonal to current defense spending, but it best explains future movements in defense spending over a horizon of 5 years. So I'm going to show mostly those three. There are other ways to identify it. I talk about those some in the chapter. So just to give you an idea of what kind of results you get. So the red is what you get with Blanchard and Perotti. Blue is from my newspaper. And the green is from Benzeev and Papa. So first of all of them increase government spending, but consistent with what I've argued, mine is a news variable. Government spending doesn't jump up right away. It takes a while. It's news now, and then government spending goes up and comes down. By construction, Blanchard and Parati, you're going to have an increase in government spending right away because it's just the unforecastable part of government spending based on a simple VAR. Okay? So that's what you see there, and I've just normalized everything so that those peaks were the same. So the good news on the consensus is all three of these predict an increase in GDP. All right? So all three of them are suggesting that the government spending multiplier, however you want to define it, is positive. Okay? It's different. The Benzene Papa news is actually quite big. The Blanchard and Parati is actually one of the smallest. It goes up the same amount, but then it comes down quite a bit for GDP. Now, there's a difference with consumption. So the Blanchard and Parati predicts that consumption goes up, which sounds very Keynesian, whereas the two news variables say that consumption goes down. This is for non-durables and services. I'm not going to go through all of them. There's all kinds of stories about that jump on durables, but I'm not going to go into that here. You can also look at investment. There's differences across the two about whether real wages go up or down and what happens to the components of investment. Let me just summarize. Now, it's interesting that Blanchard and Parati is the only one that gets an increase in consumption, but it actually has the smallest multipliers. So the Blanchard and Parati implied 2-year multiplier using cumulative method is only 0.4. Using my news variable, it's 0.8, and Benzene Papa 1.4. All right, so there's a difference in the implied multipliers. None of them are anywhere near those Keynesian multipliers of 3, 4, or 5, and they're more, on either side of 1. Consumption and real wages, Blanchard and Parati tends to imply one thing. The news variables imply the opposite. What you're doing. Yeah, you can do present value, but it tends not to matter. That's really the correct way to do it, but it's kind of nice. It's just the area under the impulse response function for GDP up to a horizon divided by the area under the government purchases function. Okay, and then in my latest paper, we actually figured out a way to estimate that in just one step using IV. So it's where you define sums of variables. Okay. Conclusions about government spending shocks. The only consistent result is that GDP does go up, all right? So multipliers are probably positive, but how much it goes up depends on the method. Each method has its weaknesses, influential observations, anticipations, low relevance, and it's a puzzle that the Blanchard-Parati shock is the only one that produces a rise in consumption, and yet it produces such a small multiplier. So more work needs to be done on that. Tax shocks, okay? So some leading methods for identification here. All right, so we're thinking about changes in tax rates. What is the effect on the economy, and how important is it for output fluctuations? So again, you can use a S-bar. Actually, that shouldn't be Cholesky decomposition. They use external sources to set the endogenous part of the tax response in order to back out the exogenous shocks. Romer looked through legislative records to find changes in tax rates that were not influenced by the current state of the economy, and then created a series. And then Mertens and Robin did a nice thing, which is that they split the Romer series into ones where the tax change was implemented within 90 days versus one where there was a longer delay. And they called one the unanticipated, and they called the other one the anticipated. In contrast to the government spending results, the tax results are really robust, okay? So the Romer basically found tax multipliers about minus 2.5 or minus 3. Mertens and Robin used their proxy SVAR to estimate that and get very similar results, all right? So they seem to be really, really big. We're not sure why, but that seems to be a relatively robust empirical result. Yet another robust empirical result has to do with tax news. That is news about future tax changes. So Leeper, Walker, and Yang demonstrate the problems that fiscal foresight causes for standard VARs. And they argue one of the best ways to deal with it is to try to measure the news and just incorporate it in the VAR. There's two main methods. There's what Mertens and Robin did with the Romer shock that I told you about. But then there's also a completely independent way of doing it, which is Spreads between federal and municipal bonds in the US, and this is Leeper, Richter, Walker, and then Kuhn. In the United States, the federal government is not allowed to tax the interest income from state and local bonds, all right? So that means that if you look at the spread between them, that is going to be related to what the federal tax rate is. And if you look at ones of different term structures, that tells you what people think the tax rate is going to be in the future. Now, here is Mertens and Robin using the Romer things, and rather than just focusing on one. So they're sort of doing a case study where 0 is where the tax effect goes in. So according to their variable, when there's news that taxes are going to increase in the future, GDP, consumption hours, investment go up right now, all right? And then when taxes actually go up, those variables go down. This is exactly what intertemporal consumption, or intertemporal substitution says you should do, all right? If you know your tax is going to go up later, you should consume more now. We're also seeing this more even in micro studies, like studies of when the value-added tax was raised in Europe. In certain European countries, consumption jumps now. And you certainly see this. If you know that the tax on cars is going to go up 10% after starting in the next year, you'll see that everybody starts buying cars in advance. And you're seeing this also in the aggregate data. Now, what's really neat, it's not real precise, it depends on how you estimate it. But what's really neat is I took the series from your paper, and I don't think you guys exactly did this, and I put it in the Georgia local projection method to see what the effect of tax news was. And qualitatively, I was getting the same results. So this is, in contrast to the monetary, that if you have news about a future increase in taxes, output, consumption, those sorts of things go up now and then go down in the future. So these kinds of things that Ed Prescott talks about seem to be there in the data, that these intertemporal effects on taxes can really matter. All right? So very robust effects on taxes in terms of what we see with the impulse response functions. All right, technology shocks finally. Okay, this is third. All right, most believe that technology is the driver of long-run growth. What was revolutionary was when Kitlin and Prescott first suggested, well, maybe it's also the source of business cycles, changes in the rate of growth of technology. And then Baudry and Portier revived the idea that, well, maybe news about future technology could drive business cycles. All right, so leading identification methods. So Kitlin and Prescott, of course, just used the solar residual and said that was TFP. And that was okay until, I think it was Charlie Evans, who's now president of the Chicago Fed, said, well, geez, it's Granger caused by a lot of other variables, so I don't think it's exogenous. And we all worried that there was utilization in there. So then another method that's used widely now by Fernald and others is a purge solar residual to try to purge it from the unobserved utilization. Long-run restrictions, that's something I've used. Medium-run restrictions. Estimated Dsge models, where you estimate your dynamic model and then you back out the shocks. And then for new shocks, adding stock prices, consumer confidence, and things like that to try to back out what the news is. For investment-specific technological change, a really important variable is the relative price of investment goods. And there are a number of really useful papers that talk about that. So in this part of the chapter, I explored 3 kinds of technology shocks. Neutral technology shocks, which are the A in that top one, and investment-specific technology shocks. And this is from the Justiano, Primatieri, and Tambolati paper. That's going to be that psi there, that's the efficiency with which you turn investment goods into investment. And then they also really emphasize this marginal efficiency of investment, which is, given your investment goods, how does that turn into capital? All right, so that's the view there. And I finally got smart at this part. Rather than re-estimating everybody's thing, I just sent emails out to my friends. I said, send me your shock. Okay. So, and then that's also the neat thing about the Jordan method, is then I could just take it and look at the impulse responses with respect to all these shocks. So here's just 3 of them that I looked at for neutral. So John Fernald's purge solar residual, which, by the way, he's at the San Francisco Fed. He updates that series all the time, so you can easily extract it from there. Ford, which is Francis, Aoying, Rausch, and DeCecchio's medium-run restrictions, and then the Justiano et al. Dsge estimates. So very different estimates. I'm not going to, because I want to save some time for questions. I mean, in general, GDP goes up, labor productivity goes up. I have to say, I feel, given my GME paper found this negative effect on hours following Gali, all three of those methods actually show a negative effect on hours in the short run before hours start increasing. So it looks like there could be a little bit, this sort of positive technology shock does reduce hours for at least a few quarters. Stock prices tend to go up, consumption goes up, non-residential investment goes up, just as you would expect with technology shocks. Now here is investment-specific technology news. All right, so it's a little bit of background. As I mentioned, the investment-specific technology, everybody who tries to identify that is, a key thing that they're using to identify is the relative price of investment goods. And there was an earlier paper by Munuchika Katayama on using this kind of method just here. And Jonas Fisher had a nice paper in the JPE that suggested that these were really important shocks, but that was before people started talking about news. And a recent paper by Ben-Zeev and Khan sort of decomposed that shock and figured out it was mostly the news part rather than the unanticipated part. And they find that it leads to things that look like business cycle effects, and as I'll show you, turn out to be really important for explaining business cycles. All right, so just summary of some of the findings. I had many other shocks. I look at whether they were correlated with each other. Most of the shocks, except for the investment-specific technology shocks, because they're all using that same variable, most of them have very low correlation with each other. They're all claiming that they have the shock for technology or this and that, and very low correlation. Many of the shocks are serially correlated or Granger caused by other variables, which again, we don't want that to happen with shocks. One of the shocks that seems to be promising both for generating business cycle code movements and for contributing significant amounts to the variance of output are these investment-specific technology shocks. So what are the shocks that drive business cycles? So this is where I take sort of my favorite ones from each of those three categories, just to see how much we can add up to in the variance decomposition, all right? Because different shocks are available at different things. This is from 1954 to 2005, and it's a quarterly sample. And here are the results for output. So I'm kind of sad government spending doesn't account for much. Part of it is because the Korean War isn't in there, and the wars after that just weren't very significant. If you put World War II in there, it would be. But that's okay. It's good if our government isn't destabilizing the economy. So again, this is good news for policy. Tax news shocks, you get some there, but this is not a big effect. Unanticipated taxes, so very robust effects when they happen, but as drivers of business cycles, they don't seem to be very important. TFP, decently high, it's in the teens. Investment-specific technology news, here we're getting ones up in the 20s. Marginal efficiency of investment shock, again, this is the Justiano, that can be quite significant at short horizon. Now, one thing is that might be financial frictions, so we have to look more to figure out exactly what kind of shock that is. And the federal fund shock, again, that's just not doing very much. Now, remember, this is even going back to 54. On hours, let me just start over here. On hours, it actually, federal funds shock matters more. Again, we're talking about the bad old days when there was more instability. Government spending news, not that important. Tax, fiscal. TFP is not very important for hours. Remember, I showed you hours goes in the wrong direction in the short run. But investment-specific technological change and the marginal efficiency of investment, that's where we're getting a lot of the shocks. Now, Cochrane, was pessimistic, but though nobody had really talked about those kinds of shocks before. And once you put those in, they account for much more of the fluctuations at business cycle horizons. So, conclusions. Monetary and fiscal policy shocks are not important drivers of business cycles on average. This is a good thing. Our government is not destabilizing the economy, okay? Both Dsge estimated shocks and SFAR estimated shocks suggest that investment-specific technology shocks are leading drivers of business cycles and also this marginal efficiency shock. But again, this marginal efficiency of investment shock might be linked to financial conditions. So I think there might still be hope for the credit market shock people. And So I conclude we have made progress since Cochrane's pessimistic forecast. I think we still have a ways to go, but I think we've made quite a bit of progress, in large part because theorists and empiricists talk to each other in macro. So I think that that's why we've been able to make that kind of progress. Okay, thank you. Questions? Everybody's tired. Yes.
So you talked about SRs almost entirely in terms of
Yes, but
there is also work where there's simultaneous.
yes, yes.
For whatever reason, that doesn't seem to be very popular. Do you have any views on that?
On that, I mean, so at SFAR, say Bleichard and Parati, what they do with the tax results, is that what you're, I mean, is that one example of what you would say other contemporaneous restrictions?
Well, I mean, there's stuff on monetary policy.
Yeah.
You estimate money demand and money supply simultaneously.
Right, right. But, you know, again, do they get the sort of beautiful results? Because I know one thing that, oh, they do. Okay, is this one of your papers? That So what was your identifying assumption? Yeah, yeah. No, so.
Because it was trying to deal with this price puzzle problem.
Yes, yes.
You don't think it's a puzzle.
It is oh, yes, which, yes, I have a paper suggesting, and it's not necessarily, yes, that was, because I kept getting, when I subject these other ones, I kept getting price puzzles again. And you really get the price puzzle, I think it was in the later data, yeah. I don't know why. Were they complicated? I mean, that's one thing in macro. If it's complicated, people don't.
Well, I think it's
Yeah. So that's probably it. You know, the Cholesky decomposition was just the go-to, and people treat Blanchard and Parati as this big kind of thing, but you know, they're just presetting one coefficient. Was the one that you did basically presetting a coefficient, or no? And it,
old-fashioned stuff. Where you
oh yeah. In two unknowns. But then you'd had to have your excluded instruments, which is, yeah, a nice way to do it. But, yeah, I don't know why. And it got beautiful because, you know, also because people have such strong priors about the effects of monetary. If you don't get beautiful results, you know, then they don't do anything with them. You know. Uh-huh. Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. They aren't very clear. Yeah. I mean, so I can. So Blanchard and Parati got smaller tax multipliers, and the Mertens and Robin, what they did was that they could then estimate that parameter that Blanchard and Parati preset by using the Romer estimates. And they figured out that that parameter was very different from what Blanchard and Parati preset. Now, there's a nice paper by Dario Caldara and Comps that shows that that parameter that you preset, if you look at the effect on the multiplier you estimate, that it's very steep there. So small changes in that preset parameter lead to big changes in multipliers. Yeah, so, I mean, the Mertens and Robin did a reconciliation of the two. Of course, you know, Favreau and I wouldn't say there was a consensus, but there. Yeah, it's hard. You have to do a lot to get rid of that result. Is my feeling. I mean, because Blanchard and Parati, I don't think that their identification method is very good. No, it is. Because they use, their two is raising taxes due to inherited deficits, wasn't it? And then for long-run growth concerns. Now, what's interesting is one of those is a reason to raise taxes, the other one's a reason to lower taxes. So there's other possible issues there. Yeah. Right. right. No. Uh-huh. But how many restrictions do you need to impose what? Inside restrictions. Sign restrictions. Oh. I haven't used sign restrictions. How many do you need to impose? Do you have used? Okay. Yeah, you're right. What you put in is what you get out. So there's several new working papers on this. So Harold Uhlig has a new paper using Bayesian sign restrictions. And then there's several papers by, not Fernandez Villaverde, his Juan Rubio Romero and Arias and stuff that are, they say that what Uhlig had done previously wasn't right. And so anybody who wants to use sign restrictions, I suggest go look at that. And then also Stock and Watson have a nice section in their chapter. And if I have to use sign restrictions at some point, I'm going to read that section because I just haven't used. I haven't used them myself because they were just never that intuitive to me. But people are very excited by what they call set identification. So I can see people using it in other contexts. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Yes. Yeah. So instrument relevance is a big thing. Okay, but that's trying to identify a shock through an innovation in a VAR. And what I argue is sort of the narrative. My narrative is a new shock, and so they told me that what Stock and Watson have on that external instrument is probably not fundamental. So that's why when I use it in the Jordan method, so my latest paper with Sarah Zuberi, we're really careful about instrument relevance. And the instrument relevance is really bad at short horizons, but that's what it's supposed to be with the new shock, right? It's not going to affect government spending, say, right away. But then we get really good relevance at the medium horizons. So it's a really tricky issue, and everybody working in that literature is still working through it, what exactly it means. Yeah, but yeah, so instrument relevance is important, and I think that might be a problem with the external instruments approach, but it's different from the way I've been implementing it. But again, we're kind of learning as we're going along on that one. So keep checking Stock and Watson's websites because they keep having new paper. Because they have a brand new paper with Montiel Olea, I think, that's looking at some of these issues.
Any more questions? We still have a little bit time. No, it's great.
Great.
Thanks, brother.
Okay.